Story 1. The Haunted House. After my father's tragic death, I inherited his remote cabin near Mount Bachelor in Oregon. The cabin, surrounded by towering pines and nestled in snow-covered forests, was supposed to be a refuge from the grief and chaos of everyday life. With the cabin empty and without a tenant for the next month, I found it the perfect place to find solace. I packed my skis, along with my loyal dog Midnight, and headed to the cabin. The first few days were wonderful. The snow was beautiful, and I spent hours skiing down the private slope, enjoying the serenity of the winter landscape. Midnight came and I explored the surrounding woods, and I found comfort in the isolation. But on the third day, a heavy snowfall trapped me in the cabin. The storm was relentless, and the howling wind made the cabin creak ominously. As I played Midnight, I noticed something was wrong. Fresh footprints appeared in the snow around the cabin. They led into the woods but stopped suddenly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. Unease began to creep over me, but I dismissed it, assuming it was a neighbor or an animal. That night, I heard Midnight growling and barking at the door. Her behavior was unusual, and her agitation made me uneasy. I decided to investigate, opening the door but finding nothing but swirling snow. Midnight seemed to sense something I couldn't see, pulling on her leash and staring at the dark trees with intense concentration. Back inside, I tried to reassure both Midnight and myself. But as night fell, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a steady, purposeful tread on the roof. It was too steady to be snow or an animal. My flashlight scanned the roof, but I saw nothing. My pulse quickened, and Midnight's anxious moans added to my fear. As I stared into the darkness, my flashlight illuminated a horrifying sight. A gaunt figure crouched in a tree, arms unnaturally outstretched and mouth open in a silent, terrifying scream. I froze in fear, unable to. The figure remained motionless, its eyes fixed on me with a haunting intensity. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it with shaking hands. I tried to call out, but my voice was a whisper. Midnight was still with me, his presence a small comfort. I spent the rest of the night in a state of tension, listening to the storm and the unsettling sounds outside. The next morning, I packed up and left the cabin, unable to escape the ghostly image. The peaceful retreat I had hoped for was overshadowed by a terrifying encounter. The thought of the ghost lurking in the woods haunted me, and I vowed never to return to the cabin alone. Story 2. The Lonely Stalker. Our family estate in Vermont, a sprawling estate nestled in the heart of the woods, is usually a winter wonderland. It boasts a private slope ideal for skiing and snowboarding. This year, I decided to invite Melissa, a close friend who had just started snowboarding. The idea was to get away from our busy lives and enjoy some quiet time together. The property was secluded, perched on a steep hill, and surrounded by a dense, dark forest, making it the perfect retreat. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The house, a large log cabin, was rustic and charming, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace. The adjacent barn, which housed our ski equipment, was easily accessible from the house and overlooked the vast expanse of snow. The first day was perfect. The snow was fresh and untouched, and the sun was shining brightly. I took Melissa to the slope behind the house, eager to share my passion for skiing with her. She was enthusiastic but struggled at first, falling freak despite the occasional fall. She was determined, and by the end of the afternoon, she was used to it. We celebrated with hot cocoa and laughter by the fire, the warmth inside in stark contrast to the cold, still darkness outside. As the night fell, a sense of peace settled over the entire house. The forest, so inviting before, now seemed more ominous, with shadows stretching like dark fingers through the trees. We had dinner and decided to relax in the living room, chatting about the day's events and planning for the next day. Around 10 p.m., as we were relaxing, we heard a strange, intermittent sound coming from outside. It was a faint, almost rhythmic crunch of snow, like footsteps, but not quite. Melissa and I exchanged worried glances, assuming the noise was wildlife or perhaps someone nearby. We tried to ignore it, but the noise continued, getting louder and more distinct. We decided to investigate, hoping to dispel our growing anxiety. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, leaving Melissa with a promise that I would be right back. The cold air hit me immediately, and the snow crunched under my boots. The shadows of trees flickered ominously as I walked toward the barn, where the noise seemed to be coming from. When I reached the barn, I saw nothing unusual, just the familiar sight of our ski suits and a cold, hard silence. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I shined my flashlight around, scanning the area, but saw no sign of a disturbance. The only thing I noticed was a series of fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the woods to the barn and back. Feeling uneasy, but determined to protect ourselves, I went back into the house and locked the door. Melissa was clearly worried, and we both tried to ignore the fear that was spreading. We decided to stay awake, turning on the lights and drawing the curtain. The fire crackled softly, providing some comfort, but the eerie silence outside was unsettling. Around midnight, we heard that cry again, a distant, drawn-out, cold cry muffled by the wind, but unmistakably human. The sound was heart-wrenching, almost pleading, and seemed to be coming from the direction of the woods. My heart pounded as I glanced at Melissa, who was clutching the armrest of the sofa in fear. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. Snow had started to fall again, obscuring my vision, but I could see movement in the trees. The flashlight beam revealed a disturbance in the snow and a few dark figures darting between the trees. The unsettling realization hit me. Someone or something was out there. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I went out again, the cold stinging my cheeks. I followed the tracks, but they seemed to lead deeper into the woods, and then stopped abruptly. The woods were silent now, the only sound the occasional creaking of branches under the weight of new snow. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I returned home, my nerves frayed and my mind racing. Melissa and I spent the rest of the night huddled together, our eyes trained on every sound and shadow. The fire was low, and the cold seemed to seep into every wall of the house. When morning finally came, we quickly packed up, the events of the night before weighing heavily on us. The grounds, once a cherished refuge, now seemed fraught with danger. As we left, I took one last look at the woods, hoping that whatever had been lurking there was now gone. The isolation of the grounds and the haunting presence of the stalker had turned our peaceful getaway into a terrifying ordeal, leaving us with a deep sense of dread and unease. Story 3. The Uninvited Guest. This was supposed to be a much-needed getaway for my friends, Angel, Amy, and Jessica, and me. We'd been saving for months for this ski trip to Colorado, renting a spacious Airbnb in Snowmass, just a stone's throw from the famed Aspen Mountain Ski Resort. Also, I was excited but nervous. I'd always struggled with snowboarding. My previous attempts at Bunny Hill had been a farce, So this trip was both a challenge and a chance to prove myself. Our first day went smoothly. The slopes weren't crowded, thanks to the fact that it was a weekday. I took it slow, determined to get better despite falling frequently. During breaks, I sat on the slopes, trying to catch my breath and warm up. That's when he approached. A man whose appearance was as unsettling as his demeanor. He was tall, his hair was messy, and he wore an ill-fitting jacket that made him look out of place. His eyes seemed overly eager as he started chatting, asking if I was okay, and then commenting on how beautiful I was, even though my helmet and mask obscured most of my face. I tried to ignore him, but he continued, and his intrusive questions made me uncomfortable. I quickly texted my friends, urging them to meet me at the hostel, hoping to escape his unsettling presence. The rest of the day passed uneventfully as we all returned to the Airbnb, exhausted but happy. We decided to relax in the hot tub, trying to forget about the strange encounter earlier. That night, after a few drinks and some laughter, we all retired to our separate rooms. I was lying in bed, scrolling through TikTok, when I heard footsteps in the common area. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, but as the footsteps grew louder and closer, a sense of dread rose within me. The noise was getting closer to my room, and I could hear the doorknob turning. Panic set in as I picked up my phone and texted the group chat. No one answered. I felt my pulse quicken as I crept to the door and pressed my ear to it. The footsteps had stopped, but a faint, rhythmic sound continued. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth outside my door. I held my breath as I heard the doorknob turn again. I quickly backed away, my mind racing. I locked the door and called 911, whispering into the phone. "Please, you need to send someone. Someone is trying to get into my room." The operator's calm voice reassured me, but the pounding on the door grew more frantic. I heard a cold voice on the other end say, "Okay, honey." The footsteps retreated, leaving an eerie silence. When the police arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the house, checking every possible entry point. Although they found no signs of forced entry, they assured us that they would be patrolling the area. We were shocked, unable to shake the feeling that the man from the slopes was somehow involved. The next morning, we packed up and checked out of the Airbnb, deciding to spend the rest of our trip at a nearby motel. The thrill of our ski adventure was overshadowed by the fear of that unsettling encounter.